Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, your AI Compliance Playbook, presented by Whiteford, WCA Technologies, and Partnership to End Addiction. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select Telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. All attendees are in listen-only mode. You have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send your questions in at any time during the presentation, and we will collect these and address them at the conclusion of the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded. The information contained in this presentation is provided for general informational purposes only and not intended to serve as legal advice. A copy of the audio recording and slide deck will be emailed to you within 72 hours of the completion of this live presentation. And now, without further ado, I would like to pass the presentation over to Keith. Keith, all you.
Thanks, Rachel. Welcome, everybody. Here we're talking about AI compliance. I'm Keith Molesdale. I'm co-chair of the Data Security and Privacy Group at Whiteford. I'm basically a tech lawyer and focused on all aspects of technology, including AI.
I'm Peter Fiedler. I'm president and co-founder of WCA Technologies. We're a New York City-based IT company. Been around for 37 years, almost 37 years, supporting nonprofits, financial firms, and small businesses throughout New York City.
Hi everybody, I'm Tim and I am the Chief Information Officer at Partnership to End Addiction. We are a nonprofit in Midtown, New York, and I oversee all the internal technology, computer infrastructure here in the organization, and I also participate in data security and cybersecurity aspects of the things, and then also participate in the day-to-day leadership of the organization.
So why the heck are we here today? We're here to talk about artificial intelligence. Here's the agenda. But before I dive into the agenda, I just wanted to comment that it seems like everybody is talking about AI as the industrial revolution. And I decided to do a little research, of course, using AI. So I don't know whether this is true or not, but McKinsey, actually referenced by AI, says that the adoption of AI globally this year is already at 72%, which is an enormous adoption rate for a technology that's fairly new. So with that in mind, our agenda is first to talk about what is AI, so we understand actually what it is, because a lot of people don't know or think they know. Number two is let's determine what the differences are between the different types of AI tools and models. Then we're going to talk about and dive into what we think are the top 10 business and legal risks that arise from an organization, for-profit, nonprofits' use of AI. And then last of all, we're going to glue all of that information together into a playbook to help folks figure out, if you're just starting from scratch with AI, where do you start? So what is AI? If you really boil it down, it's really about trying to make computers think and act like human beings, which of course is not an easy task. So that as a result, there are different kinds of AI in various stages of development. The one I think most consumers are familiar with is generative AI, and that's AI like Copilot or Chat GPT, which are using data on the internet and publicly available information to train the models. And so, for example, it's looking at documents, looking at how people write and determining and basically learning how the best way to write is and to report back on information. Now, Peter's going to talk about the more complex parts.
Yeah, but I'm going to try to break it down as simple as possible. So machine learning, I was trying to think of an easy example of machine learning, and the thing that came to me was when you first set up your iPhone, it's looking at your face, and it's actually learning your face. So when you log in to your iPhone, it knows your face. It has you turn left, it has you turn left, look up, look down, and it's actually, that's part of machine learning. And that could be, whether it's for your iPhone or in terms of navigation systems, Waze or Google Maps. These are all sort of learning systems. So I just wanted to sort of give some practical examples of machine learning. Now, deep learning is a subset of machine learning. Things like Alexa or Siri, or a lot of the speech recognition systems that are out there. Some machine translation systems that are out there, and some. It does do some analytics, but I just wanted to keep it as simple as possible. Next slide. So we wanted to talk about the different models of AI, and public, commercial, and private. So let's first talk about the public. It's interesting about ChatGPT. ChatGPT, came on the latter part of 2022, and within, a few days it went from 0 to 1 million users. And then within a little bit after that, it went to 100 million users. So it really, really caught on. And those are things like ChatGPT, a lot of people are using it. It's free, it's available. The advantages are there are no out-of-pocket fees. There's a large community for support. The disadvantages are, and I'll say the number one item on this list is data loss. You don't know what they're capturing. They're learning from you. All the prompts that you put in there, like whatever the questions are, and whatever you put in there is in there forever. So I just want you to be aware of that. Some of the commercially available AI models are Copilot, and IBM Watson, the ones I'm most familiar with. Now, IBM and both IBM and Microsoft have made huge investments in these infrastructures. So they saw this as an opportunity to incorporate them into their products. Watson has an incredible database. It's very quick. We use Watson for some of our help desk items where we ingest, some either knowledge base articles, or if we fix a problem, it gets ingested automatically. So you can control what goes into these items. So you wouldn't want to put your entire universe in something like this, because then it's available to everybody who uses that application. There are, the disadvantages are licensing fees. So you're going to have to pay for it. There are some free versions of Microsoft Copilot. I'll go into that a little later. But for the most part, Microsoft is going to charge you $30 a month per user, a minimum of a year you have to pay up front. And these are available both, cloud, hybrid, or on-premise. So you can sort of, incorporate some of your on-premise stuff and to populate some of these commercially available models that are out there. And Keith, talk about private.
Yeah, aside from the AI models that we see on the internet or we see in our organizations that are licensed, there are also private AI models, which means that there are organizations who behind the scenes are building and using AI models to actually process their own data, make decisions, and create products that are then pushed out to consumers. That's all kind of done, behind the scenes using private data, confidential data. It's an incredibly expensive process, but it does happen. So, for example, one of my fintech clients uses private AI behind the scenes to generate products that they provide to businesses. Next slide, please. So now that we know what AI is at a high level, let's dive into what the three of us, Tim, Peter, and I, think are the top 10 business and legal risks of using AI tools.
So this is interesting, disinformation. And, just because it's out there doesn't mean it's true. So if you look at the initial version of ChatGPT, there was a lot of really bad data out there. So as a test, what I did was I got a practice test from Microsoft, and I said, let me use ChatGPT to take this test for me. So I just copied and pasted the test questions in there, and the end result was I got about a 55, 56 on this test. So a lot of the information that was in there as it relates to the test I was taking was about 2 or 3 years old. So there's really a lot of bad information out there. So you really have to be careful, and we'll go into a little bit more and tell some stories of some other cases where there was some bad information that actually hurt people. All right, so here's a quiz, and we sort of did this as a goof because of the bad information out there. And just want to see, what AI suggested as a pizza recipe. So we list these 4 items, and I'm not going to read them, but I just want everybody to take a look at it. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that mixing glue into pizza ingredient was actually out there. And the reasoning was, and somebody was making a joke, when they referenced this, they were making a joke, is the glue actually keeps the cheese on the pizza. So again, you need to check the information, check the sources. So, but I just wanted to put that out there as sort of a fun goof that's out there.
So in addition to disinformation, one of the biggest risks is IP infringement. What I think many people don't understand is, especially when using public and even using commercially licensed IP tools, those IP tools always have to refer to data, or they need to learn from other data that's publicly available. The challenge is, and so for example, say you have someone who decides in marketing, I want to write a marketing piece about these 2 products. So they ask AI to write a piece, and then the output is so fantastic. This person in marketing decides, I'm just going to use this as my white paper. I'm going to use this in advertising. Well, there's a risk that actually the AI is copying too much from third-party sources and actually infringing their copyrights. There's also a risk, for example, if they're copying people's voices or copying people's images. And so you may have heard in the last week a lot of talk about Scarlett Johansson and her complaints about OpenAI's use of a voice that sounds substantially similar to her, and even her own friends can't tell the difference. So that's a risk for every organization, although at the moment, it's really the big players in the multimedia world who are engaged in some litigation. So for example, right now there's a class action against Microsoft and GitHub and OpenAI regarding the use of content. There's Getty Images, which if you've ever tried to license an image off of the internet, there are, I guess, hundreds of thousands, I'd imagine, or more images. The problem is there's also an engine that's similar to ChatGPT, which really focuses on images. It's called Stable Diffusion. And you can ask Stable Diffusion to create almost anything. Well, Getty Images is suing Stable Diffusion for using its images without authorization. And then there's also a bunch of authors like John Grisham who are suing OpenAI for using their books to train their AI. So there are quite a lot of risks out here, which can actually potentially flow down to your organization.
There was also the New York Times is suing ChatGPT and Microsoft for using a lot of their content also. So just, so they had all their articles, thousands of articles just ingested into ChatGPT. So it's gonna be really interesting to see what happens there. Next slide.
So the third risk, and this is one I think actually I see the most discussed with our clients, is the potential risk of violating privacy laws and privacy related regulations. Peter mentioned how you've got to be careful with, for example, public AI, such as ChatGPT, because whatever you enter into the engine the tool is going to absorb it, keep it, train on it, and actually use it to answer other people's questions. So there are lots of scenarios that happen, especially when people don't understand how the AI works. So for example, say you have somebody in your employment department who's got a chart of employees, social security numbers, and wages, and it's an extensive chart, and they want to reorganize it and say, hey, let's see if ChatGPT can help me reorganize this chart. Well, ChatGPT probably can do a great job of reorganizing that chart. But once that data is put into the prompt field and ChatGPT is asked to run a search, ChatGPT is going to keep that information. So actions like that create risks for organizations of violating existing privacy laws that exist and apply regardless of the newness of AI. Next slide, please. So I don't want to go into detail here, but I just want to give you just a quick snapshot of all of the existing privacy laws that can and do already come into play when using AI. Of course, there are all kinds of federal laws like HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, FERPA. There's about 20 state laws states that have comprehensive privacy laws, some of which specifically use words that refer to what AI does, but may not use the word AI itself. And there are also all kinds of international laws which also implicate AI, again, without specifically referring to it, like the GDPR in Europe. Next slide. It's also possible to breach contractual duties. Imagine you've hired, say, a services company like a law firm, or an IT consulting company like Peter's organization. If you have a specific conversation with somebody and expect them to deliver, and then they in the background just use some AI model to generate the results, you might be thinking, hey, I'm getting Peter's advice, or I'm getting Keith's advice. The bottom line is most contracts before this day and age weren't necessarily drafted with AI in mind. And so there are a lot of organizations who need to think about potentially amending their terms and conditions to address potential risks and lawsuits from customers and clients who might not realize how you're producing results. Next slide, please.
So in terms of the ethical risks, Tim was going to give some examples of Keith was going to give the legal aspect, and Tim was going to give some examples of something happened in his organization. In terms of the one thing I will mention is the erosion of human skills, where people become so dependent about AI that all of a sudden they stop thinking. They just depend on ChatGPT. They depend on some AI, and their brain, when you stop using your brain for a certain thing, it gets weaker. So it's really important, just so that's sort of the advantage that I see of using ChatGPT and AI. Tim, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Yeah. So one of our systems on the website has a built-in sort of phone add-on, and this company that we were going to use, wanted to, they were very excited in working with us and wanted to use some of the conversations to help their AI to get better at what they do. But unfortunately, a lot of these conversations that happens are highly confidential. So in instances like that, if we didn't really look into it deeper, we're giving out a lot of sensitive information, and that creates a lot of ethical issues. And another example, AI components is being added into all sorts of software these days, right? And everything from Microsoft to Adobe to even Zoom. Zoom just earlier this year added a whole new component for AI, and they're really, really cool. But that's also something that our team has really thought through, and we're like, well, maybe we're not ready yet for that kind of things to be in our meeting, because then you don't know when in the meeting you don't know when something sensitive is going to come up. A lot of times these things, just names comes up, numbers come up, and you don't know where that's going if AI is going to analyze that. So even though there are really so-called really cool features, but at the same time, I think it is helpful to kind of step back and say, well, it's very, very helpful, but how is that going to become a problem? And so that's, in this second example, this is something that we haven't enabled. We're still thinking about it. We're still investigating it. We're still trying to see how that is.
And on the legal side, it's kind of easy to think of a couple of examples. For example, self-driving cars. That's a perfect example of where organizations have existing tort duties to engage in reasonable care to protect people from foreseeable harms. So if you are, Uber self-driving cars, or you are producing Teslas or any kind of electric car that has self-driving modes, there are pre-existing laws which require people to the manufacturers who are, if they use AI, to protect individuals. And there's also other requirements and other existing laws that can come into play. And this will vary, of course, based on the way AI is used in your organization and what your organization does. So for example, if your organization decides to use AI to screen employees, you can't, and then that AI discriminates against people based on gender, race, sex, sexual preference, etc. The organization is going to be responsible for that. It can't just say, oh, sorry, that was the AI that did that. Those legal responsibilities remain. And then other legal responsibilities, for example, if you're a bank or a financial institution, you're engaged in lending, the same thing. The anti-bias rules as it relates to lending still exist. Next slide, please. So far, in terms of the law, I've been focusing on, existing privacy laws, existing tort laws. Right now, what I talk about is actual laws that were passed that focus specifically on the use of artificial intelligence, or ADM, which is automated decision making. Next slide, please. So there are lots of places we have to look to as lawyers and as organizations to consider whether we're actually complying with the new wave of AI legislation. There are already international laws, federal laws here in the US, and also state laws in the US. Next slide. There are a number of countries I can just mention very briefly that have AI laws already, but the most important is the EU. They've been a leader in privacy and now AI around the world, and most countries around the world are following their lead. And that's also true when it comes to AI. So the AI has passed, the European Union recently, just in May, just last month, a few days ago, passed this new Artificial Intelligence Act. It's quite interesting, and I think already there's some other jurisdictions following it. And what they've done is they divided the risk of AI into different categories. So they said, look, there's certain AI that's absolutely prohibited, it's unacceptable because the risk is too high. And they've deemed, for example, social scoring, where you score individuals socially, and also AI that's manipulative. They said you just can't use it at all. As it relates to high risk AI, which creates high risk to, in terms of, for example, bias, et cetera, that's highly regulated. Limited risk AI is less restrictive, but they require organizations and developers to make users aware that when they're interacting with AI, like a chatbot, that they have to actually have a warning or a notice. And then there's some minimal risks where there's lower regulations. For example, in the Gen AI field. Most of these obligations are falling on the developers, the software companies that are developing these systems, but then some are also falling on what they call the deployers, which are really the organizations that are sharing and using and connecting these AI systems with individuals. Next slide, please. There are a number of other countries, including Canada, Singapore, and China, that are considering AI laws. They haven't been passed, so I'm not going to dive into them, but this slide will be available for you to look at on your own time if you'd like to. Next slide, please. At the federal level here in the United States, there is all kinds of guidance coming down from different agencies. So for example, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, has already issued guidance making very clear a few years ago already that you can't sell or use AI systems that engage in racial bias, because that's deemed to be an unfair and deceptive practice under the FTC Act. Also, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has issued a warning in the employment context about the use of algorithms that don't account for disabilities. And also CMS, which is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, have issued guidance and warnings about using automated decision-making as it relates to denials regarding insurance payments. Next slide, please. In the United States, at the state level, there's also a number of states and jurisdictions that have passed really interesting AI laws that pretty much everybody needs to start paying attention to. The most important is Colorado. They recently passed their Artificial Intelligence Act. It's not going to be effective until 2026, so there's some time to think about it, but it's the first comprehensive state law to focus on regulating interactions between people and AI systems. Just like the European Union did in its AI Act, they distinguish between responsibilities of developers versus deployers, developers being software developers. So they're obligated under Colorado law to exercise reasonable care in AI design and deployment. For example, they have to provide comprehensive disclosures about the nature and the function of AI systems. And there are about 4 or 5 pretty important responsibilities that developers have. Deployers, those who actually deploy the AI, have responsibilities. For example, they have to engage in and undertake an impact assessment to see how the use of AI will affect consumers and others. And there's also a disclosure requirement. So if there's artificial intelligence interacting with a consumer or human being, there has to be a disclosure about that. And there also, what's kind of interesting, the last bullet here is there's an affirmative defense. And so if an organization that uses AI follows a risk management framework that's been designated by the Attorney General in Colorado, there's a defense to certain lawsuits. So that's high level what's going on in Colorado. California beat Colorado by a few years. In 2019, they made effective a more narrow law that pertains to using bots. And so this is why, for example, if you're talking with a bot on a consumer website, buying shoes or something, that consumer website has to give notice that you're actually talking to a bot and not a real person. Next slide, please. There are a few other jurisdictions. Again, I won't go into all these because there are quite a few now, but Illinois and Maryland are notable. In particular, New York City is ahead of the curve. Effective July of last year, they enacted the first law in the US that requires employers to conduct bias audits of any tools that they use to basically screen and make employment decisions. So the whole purpose of this is to ensure that basically consumers aren't discriminated against, and the candidates know what's going on. They have to give them advance notice, for example, applicants, that this is going to happen. Next slide, please. I know I keep bringing up more and more categories of laws, but there are just quite a lot of them. And another is the FTC. I mentioned very briefly the FTC before. The unfair and deceptive trade practice statute is a very strong provision, and the FTC issued guidance in April of 2021, which bans racially biased algorithms. I expect there's going to be a lot more action for the FTC, because whenever the FTC sees a consumer-facing organization in making statements or engaging in practices that they deem to be unfair or deceptive, they have the federal authority to take action and impose pretty substantial fines. Recently, their authority was challenged by some big organizations, but I think as recently as a week or two ago, the Supreme Court validated the FTC's authority. So I think they're feeling, the wind at their back again, and I'm expecting there to be a lot more action by the FTC as it relates to AI in the future. Next slide. Not to be left out, there are government contracting risks. I'm not aware of any government contractors on this panel. Next slide, please. But if you are a government contractor, just be aware that there are quite a number of statutes and guidances that are being issued by the federal government that's directing federal agencies to adopt rules and regulations that relate to how the agencies themselves operate, and also how government contractors, how they're allowed to use AI when providing services to the federal government. Next slide, please.
So this is sort of interesting. I had a conversation with a parent of a freshman in college who's learning graphic design. And their fear is when she gets out of school in 3 to 4 years, there's not going to be any jobs. So that's what's happening from a younger generation, a child. And then there are people who say, well, if we adapt AI, I'm going to lose my job. So it's really, really important to understand. And Tim, you found an interesting quote the other day that sort of addressed that. And
Yeah.
if you want to share that.
Yeah, I loved it. The CEO of NVIDIA recently said, yeah, AI is not going to take over your job. The person who uses AI will take over your job. And I feel like that maybe that is the same fear that people felt when PC became mainstream, right? In 20, 30 years ago. People are afraid that PC will take over your job. No, PC won't take over your job, but the person using PC will take over your job. So I think the AI wave is for sure coming, and it's coming at a very fast speed. It's coming in all sorts of different areas. And so I think our job is just to adopt it, but to adopt it responsibly.
Next slide.
It makes me think, Peter, about I was talking earlier about the lawsuits against the various companies, and one of them I mentioned was the one against Stable Diffusion, because that's for people who don't know, that's a website where you can, just like ChatGPT, you can make a request, and the AI tool will generate a drawing or a painting, whatever you want. And actually, it's shocking how quickly and how detailed and how well you can manipulate and create new graphics without needing a graphic designer, to your friend's point, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting where, you mentioned about the graphic artists. Tim and I were talking a few months ago about how you can sort of mimic somebody's likeliness, their voice, you're going to do a test at Tim's place about, putting the CEO's voice and a voicemail saying, buy me some gift cards. And we just couldn't come up with a way of sort of implementing, but the voice was spot on. It was crazy, and it was available on, just on some commercial available website that anybody could do it. I don't know if you want to enhance that or talk about that, Tim.
Yeah, no, it was just somebody in our organization was able to just take a sample of the audio, and then after the AI learns the way it talks, then you could basically feed in any sentence, any paragraph, and it would then be the person's voice saying whatever you want. And this is just audio. I'm sure video features like that will be coming very easily in the very near future. So.
Yeah, but getting back to the reputational risk, there was a story of it was a lawyer who was suing an airline, a personal injury case, and he created his legal brief using ChatGPT, and it cited case that didn't exist. And he filed it, and he had to go in front of the bar association, and he was terribly embarrassed. He thought that everything in ChatGPT was accurate. I think he was fined $5,000, but I think his reputation got hurt more than anything else. That was certainly an embarrassing situation. But if you look at the job you do, and if you're putting information that you think is true using ChatGPT, you need to double and triple check the resources. You need to see what resources it cites, and before you actually use it.
And Peter, what you're really giving an example of in that case with the lawyer is that ChatGPT was what the technical experts call hallucinating, because it completely made up from whole cloth cases and case names and judges and dates and law. And so what looked great on paper, when the other law firm reviewed it, they couldn't find that case. And so it's really actually kind of mind-blowing, actually, that ChatGPT hallucinated almost like a person could on mushrooms or something. And so that takes me back to one of our original slides where we're talking about the differences between the types of models. And I think that risk is much higher when it's the public, commercially available, free versions of an AI tool you're using. Whereas if you're using an AI tool, for example, my law firm uses Harvey.ai, and we're actually feeding, and we get to decide, okay, here are the cases that Harvey AI can use to help us identify issues, write drafts of briefs. So the idea is that by setting limits on what we're feeding the AI tool, it can't hallucinate like that. That's what the experts say. We shall see.
Yes, absolutely. Next slide. So we wanted to come up with a chart to really, sort of a roadmap of how to implement, artificial intelligence. And with any technology, you always want to test, you want to pilot, get feedback, and find your champion. So it's really important that this is not a one-person job, but it's an organizational job. So, but you really need to analyze and do an assessment of your data. It's a lot of it is unstructured, which means it's PowerPoint, it's Word documents, it's Excel documents, it's Adobe documents, and really understand what's in those documents. You don't want to just haphazardly feed this documents into a system. You're basically feeding live data into a system, and you're full text indexing, and you could do a search. So if you put payroll information, that means whoever has access to payroll can do a search. Who are the top 10 earners in the organization? Or if you're thinking of merging with somebody, are there any mergers? What were the last 4 mergers? And it comes up that your company is merging with somebody else. So you really have to be careful about what data you really need to analyze, what data there is, where it lives, whether it's in Office 365 or third-party resources, again, structured, unstructured, who has access. Access control is critical. It is something, and there are tools out there. There are lots of tools out there. There's a tool by AppPoint that will determine what data is sensitive. So you can use a tool like that. Microsoft has its own assessment tool that you could do and really analyze what you have. And when you're talking about access control, you want to limit the types of data. What do people really need to do their job? It's not like they may need this at some point in time, but what do they really need to do their job? And that's how you really determine who has access. And then again, how you use the data, And again, it needs to be labeled. You need to understand what the risks are, and really map out what those risks are.
And I just want to add on to a lot of, this is easier said than done. This is important, but it's not easy to do, like categorizing data. So a lot of times, if you have the resources, form a small team. Don't do this all by yourself. And if you have a team that's willing to really look at this with you, I think it just makes the experience a little bit better. And I think different people have different opinions, and there's a lot of interaction there, and it would help to make this a better experience for the organization. And Peter talked about tools. The past year or so, we moved a lot of our data from on-premise server to the cloud, and we use different products. Peter mentioned one of them. Yeah, and things like SharePoint and a lot of the cloud products. In the past, you would have to attach things in email, and email has DLP, data loss prevention. But nowadays, a lot of times when you send out things, you're sending out links. And how do you know who's sharing what with who? And so a lot of these third-party tools are very helpful in that. They just give you at a glance, hey, how many links were shared this week? Who shared them? Where were they shared to? So by leveraging these either cloud products that have these governance components in there, or third-party tools that have governance aspects, is super helpful.
Yeah, data governance is absolutely critical. Next slide. Yeah, in terms of the controls, we talked about access controls and labeling and classification. And again, labeling, putting sensitivity labels on documents is also a laborious task. Again, there are third-party tools that will do this for you. But you really need to go through this exercise before you put the data out there. Retention policies, the benefit of like Office 365 and SharePoint is now you can implement all these retention policies. So if there's data that's stale and you don't no longer need it, you can automatically remove it. But once this data is ingested into an AI system, it lives there forever. So you want to do this before, and just make sure that it has to be done in the right way. Next slide. So here's the action plan. It's really, when you're talking with an organization in terms of AI, you really need to have the goals. What do you want to achieve by using AI? And sometimes you just don't know. We're doing a pilot for some of our nonprofits. We've given some free licenses out there just to get their feedback, because we want to see how this can solve problems. So it's really important to really understand that. You want to give it to a champion. You want to, when you do identify what you want to do, you don't want to try to build the Taj Mahal in your first go round. You just want to do something that will solve, a small problem. So it's really important. And Tim, you've implemented technologies, so you certainly get it in terms of what products, how to choose products, how to use AI tools. So if you can just share your experience there.
Yeah, I think identifying people who can help, identifying people who are willing to test this technology with you, willing to give you feedback, and willing to follow policies. You could give somebody a tool if you don't trust them. It's like giving a sports car to a 5-year-old. They could drive down the road 300 miles per hour, but they're going to crash. And so that, and then part of it also we learn from hard experience. I think it's always great to learn from people's failure. It's much better to learn from other people's failure than our own failure. So sharing our failure, where yeah, for years we just allow people to use whatever they want to test. They could, if they want to install this, sure. If you want to test that, sure. And then finally we're like, okay, we gotta put a stop here. We can't just say yes to everything. We can't just say just want to try everything. So we actually now have a committee that reviews any software, any SaaS product that people want to use, and we review the user agreements. We review the privacy policies, and then we give a green light or a red light. And so again, this is not a Tim thing. This is a committee of people, and we review these things together to really hopefully to make this a better, more efficient process, a safer process, a more intentional, thought-through process for the organization. So that's, like, does that slow down things a little bit? Yes, certainly, but it keeps us at a more manageable pace instead of everybody going in 10,000 different directions.
Yeah, it's really important. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Keith.
Oh, I'm sorry, Peter. I was just going to say, don't boil the ocean, I think, the first time with anything, but particularly AI. And what you mentioned, Tim, made me think about in my own firm, at our law firm. We broke up into basically business units or legal units based on what kind of law we provide, and had each of those units provide feedback to management about what kind of tools we would like to use. And as you might imagine, in a large law firm, we're a regional law firm with like 17, 18, 19 offices, there are a lot of people wanting to use AI for different things. And so trying to address all those at the beginning would have been really mind-boggling and risky. And so we narrowed it down to 2. And that in and of itself was hard enough, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Next slide. Again, as Tim said, you want to do your due diligence on all AI tools. What are they doing? If you're using their tool, what is their security posture? What are they going to do with your data? Do they store your data, or is the data stored in your cloud, and is it contained? You do a risk assessment of any tool that's out there, and what the risks are, and you rank them high, medium, low, and I know Tim has done some risk assessments with some applications out there where there may be something that's a high risk but low probability. So they're not. So that's something you need to make a business decision on whether it's worth doing that task.
Yeah. Can I just say example? We were gonna. A few years ago, we were going to migrate one product to the cloud, and it's a pretty big company. I won't name the name, but when we met with them and just talked about security, we learned that they didn't have 2FA, and we were just blown away how in this world today, in 2022, you can have such an important product that has a lot of important information online and doesn't have 2FA. Basically, somebody guess your password, they're in. We were blown away, and when we asked them about it, they're like, "Oh, it's on our roadmap." And for something like that to only be on your roadmap in 2022, it's just it's unbelievable. And so we actually said no. We waited until one day later on when they had it. So. And was it disappointing? Yes, I think we really wanted to. I think we really wanted to move that particular product to the cloud because it would save us a lot of time. It would save a lot of efficiencies. But a process like that, right? It's just an example of, well, the vendor does not have the security that you feel like it's basic, and are you bold enough to say no to it? Maybe find another product, or maybe wait. So that was just one example.
But Tim's. Let me just say this one thing. Tim's organization was ahead of the game in terms of creating AI policies, So they were so far ahead of everybody else. So I just wanted to point that out. Go ahead, Keith.
I was just going to ask if we go back to the previous slide, because I think there's at least one point we missed there. I wanted to comment on point 2, which was identifying and defining the categories of data. I just wanted to point out that that's a process I think that a lot of organizations are used to just under existing privacy laws. But what's interesting is there are some new privacy laws that have just been adopted. For example, the new Maryland comprehensive privacy laws requires data minimization. And what that means is you can't just take any data you want to, and I think, Peter, you mentioned this a few minutes ago, or data you think you might use in the future. You can only actually use the data that you need to accomplish the service you're providing, the goal you're trying to meet. And you can't just load in personal information because that would violate this new concept of data minimization that's been around for a while, many years now, actually in Europe, but which is now starting to influence and seep into laws in the United States, including in Maryland.
Okay.
And I also wanted to mention on point 4 on this slide, which talks about investigating the laws and duties that govern your use of the AI tool. Over the course of this webinar, I've mentioned all these different categories, but I just wanted to point out to folks that those are just examples. And every organization, even organizations that are substantially similar, maybe even organizations or companies providing the same service across the street from one another, the way they go about that process is going to be different and can be different depending on, for example, where their customers are. Because one organization might have customers just in the US, the other one might have customers in Canada and Mexico. One organization might have data just in the US and the other might have data in Europe, et cetera. So what I tell clients is really like solving your own unique Rubik's Cube. You've really got to take what you were referencing in an earlier slide, Peter, really you need to engage in data mapping. And then only once you get that data from the data map can you figure out which laws apply, not only to privacy laws, but also these new AI laws.
I think we could skip a couple of slides now. Yeah, I think we covered all these other items, but with any technology, you just want to make sure you test and you train. It's not that you just do a dump and run. Say we trained them, and it's training and retraining and retraining and retraining. So it's not a one-time aspect. You really need to come up with a training plan just so people get it. Because if you just train one time and you say, well, that was part of the training, sometimes people don't get it. I mean, Tim's organization's been doing data security training for 10 plus years. It takes a number of years, and I wouldn't say it's a process, and things change, and you need to, there are possibly new uses, and you just want to be able to share whatever successes that people have, and you also want to share the failures that people have, so those mistakes are learning opportunities for other people and not just that one person who made the mistake. So it's really important to do that.
I'll share a little bit about our AI policy, how that came about too, and like many of you, you might feel this is so new. Like I'm learning, and that is the honest truth. We're all still learning, and so but we just feel like that our committee feels like we do need to have an AI policy, because that then at least gets us started. And so we started out with something really simple, and we just let it sit there. And we reviewed it over and over again, not knowing that recently 2 of our staff, one of them was our executive vice president, they went to a huge AI conference in the West Coast. And somehow they had the opportunity to meet some speakers and had some connection, and our executive vice president was bold enough to ask and say, hey, we're developing our AI policy for our organization. Do you think you would be willing to take a look at it for us? And guess what? They said yes. And so, we were able to send them our AI policy. And maybe we feel embarrassed, like this is just what we have. What do you guys think? But they were very kind. And they were very generous. They met with us later on for an hour and a half online to really give us some feedback. So you start with something, you think about it, you have a team of people look at it, and maybe at some point you get some external help, get some experts to help, and you let it, and then you have that policy, and then later on you can continue to improve on it. But I think there's got to be a start, and that start sometime is the hard part, and that then leads to training, like what Peter said. You can have the best AI policies, you can write that in the best word. But then if people don't know about it, if people don't buy it, if people don't get trained, then it's just this beautiful little flower sitting there. And so I think training is important. And so that's something that we've tried hard on. And this year, you bet we're going to add AI. There's going to be a huge AI component to our general data security training for all of our staff. And for everybody who comes in on board, they go through the same thing as well. So just sharing a little bit about how some of these things came about. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're on the last slide. Is there a slide? Yeah, so I guess it's time for questions or comments from the audience.
So I don't know if Rachel was going to read those to us, but I see a couple that are posted here for us from the audience. And one is, what kind of controls can you put in place to monitor or restrict AI usage? Can one of you guys answer that question as it relates to technological controls? I mean, you just mentioned one, Tim, being policies. Are there other things you can think of?
Maybe use AI to monitor AI stuff. No, there are, right? There are, and the reality, it is true, right? A lot of the things that monitor things are using AI. But yeah, I think they're definitely training, and they're using tools. And some of the products that we talked about before, data classification, that process is difficult, but using the right tools, you could easily identify where in your storage people are storing credit card numbers, people are storing PIIs, and those folders then maybe would have certain restrictions where you can't send a link out, or people can't just easily copy this file somewhere. These are all a much more modern approach to data storage versus in the old days where things are on a file server, and it's really hard to know what you have and where you have it. But now with the right tools, right away, it's much easier to identify where are those sensitive information. So this is just talking about data classification, but AI, I think, being vigilant about products that are now using AI. Zoom was one example. They just started to suddenly have that. Thankfully, it was disabled by default, so that it's not like suddenly out, all the meetings are being fed into AI. Photoshop, huge AI component in there, generative. What Keith was talking about before with the other product, Adobe Photoshop is doing the same exact thing. You can now do prompts, and the whole, all these masking things or very simple tasks are now all automated by AI and done very, very well. So then you just need to look at these products again and to really dive into the agreements or the user agreements that you have to agree using it. And so a lot of this, again, it seems like a lot of work, but I think some of it is important. I think you identify the bigger ones first. Don't try to attack everything, but maybe pick 3 or 4 things that's most important to you. You feel like has the most business risk, and really pay attention to these third-party tools, and see are there any things that you disagree with it, and then if the AI component is there, then you let the user know and train the users to use it responsibly.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of locking things down, you could certainly lock down what websites people can go to. You could, look for keywords that people, I mean, there are all sorts of techniques. There's screen capture programs. If you really, it can capture every screen that an employee works on, or a staff member works on. So there are tools out there. A lot of them are, but again, you need to have policies and procedures in place to let people know that these tools exist, and you're going to be watching, and also that it's all discoverable, meaning if there's a of some kind, you could always go back, look through the logs, and find out what exactly happened. Sort of, you could roll back in time. So it's something that you can really the technology's there to really watch and see what people are doing.
And to that point, Peter, about going back and looking at logs and see what people are doing, from a legal perspective, it's important that in your organization's employee handbook, it's very clear that the organization has the right to go back and look at communications and activity on the systems, and that people realize they don't have the right of privacy. Because even though you may train people, you're going to want to be able to look at what they're doing when they're actually using AI, especially at the beginning, to make sure they're actually following the rules. And we just want to make sure that the organization has the legal right to do that.
Okay, there was
Excellent.
another question about California.
Yes, another question that came in is, you mentioned the European Union's AI Act and how it is the leading worldwide model. When would the EU AI Act apply to a US-based organization with some operations in the EU?
Okay, yeah, this is always a challenge for US-based organizations that might have some employees or people traveling in the EU, or actually have some operations or maybe members or customers there. As I understand it, there are 2 triggers for when the EU AI Act could apply to a US-based organization. One is when the US organization is actually taking what the EU determines to be, quote, high risk AI output and using that in the EU. In other words, making the output available in the EU. And the other circumstance is when a US organization intends to place a high risk artificial intelligence tool on the EU market, again, regardless of where that organization is.
Excellent. And then our last question is, you said that the California Bolstering Online Transparency Act requires certain disclosures when a company uses a bot to interact with a person online. My company is located outside of California, but has chat functionality on its website to help deal with questions that can be answered without a human. We have some customers in California. Would California's Bot Act apply to my company in this case?
It depends. So just like the CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act, has thresholds that have to be looked at to determine whether the CCPA and the extent to which it applies to organizations outside of California. The same is true under the California Bot Act, which, by the way, stands for Bolstering Online Transparency Act. And the Bot Act and those notices apply only if it's a public-facing website or a public-facing app or social network with more than 10 million monthly US visitors. So it's a pretty high threshold for that requirement to apply, and so it's clearly going to apply to some of the big players. multimedia companies, for example, and big sales organizations, but probably not to many smaller organizations or even mid-sized organizations outside of California.
There was one thing I forgot to say earlier. I just want to bring it up. If people want to try out, Copilot, you can actually, if you're an Office 365 user, you could go to copilot.microsoft.com. You can log in using your Office 365 or your company's username and password, and it'll give you a real feel for the Copilot sort of version of ChatGPT and their take on Copilot, or their AI version.
Excellent. A big thank you to our panelists. I think that concludes the questions from the audience. We just want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, Your AI Compliance Playbook. On behalf of Whiteford, WCA Technologies, and Partnership to End Addiction, we thank you for joining us today, and stay well.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.